at it for a few years now. And one of my goals for this presentation is to raise awareness about and hopefully increase engagement in the climate work being done at the state level, and to hear from fellow farmers what your biggest concerns are relating to climate change, equity, and agriculture.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Keleman. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a master's student at Maine in the agroecology lab, which is in the School of Food and Agriculture. And before graduate school, I worked on a couple small vegetable farms in Northern California. And I realized while I was doing that I needed to go back to school and become involved in doing research about climate change in agriculture. So my research now is all related to climate change in agriculture, but I'm specifically interested in helping farmers with all aspects of climate change adaptation. The reason I'm here today, though, has very little to do with my research and a lot more to do with climate change broadly. I very firmly believe that we need to be taking bold action to decarbonize our state, country, and the world. And I also think that it's important that we do this work in an equitable way. During the summer of 2020, I had the opportunity to work on an assessment of the equity impacts of proposed climate strategies in Maine through the University of Maine in connection with the Maine Climate Council. And I've stayed involved in the climate action planning process in Maine since then. So that's who we are. And I'm gonna kind of kick it off, set up an agenda, set up a little bit of context. And so here we go. So what are we doing here today? Primarily, we want this to be a listening and conversation session where all of you are able to share your ideas about climate, agriculture, and equity. Melissa's going to tell you a little bit more about this later, but the Maine Climate Council's Equity Subcommittee is seeking feedback and input on how to improve Maine's climate strategies. And we're here today to help facilitate that conversation. So we want to hear your thoughts about how climate change, equity, and agriculture are connected in Maine, and what solutions might strengthen both climate and equity outcomes. Before we have that conversation, though, Melissa and I are going to provide you with some context and background information. We're both here today because we've been involved in the climate action planning process, and we think it's really, really, really important to hear what you all have to say about climate, agriculture, and equity, so that your thoughts and insights can strengthen the work of the Maine Climate Council, and more specifically, the Equity Subcommittee's report to the Climate Council. So we're mostly going to be facilitating the conversation by asking questions. We're hoping that most of the conversation is going to be between participants. And we think that this is a great opportunity to discuss the effects of climate change on agriculture in Maine, and more specifically, how the effects of climate change in Maine might be unequally felt. So the session is going to run like this. First, Melissa and I are going to talk about the Climate Council, the Equity Subcommittee, and the equity assessment that came before the Equity Subcommittee. We're going to try and make the connections between climate change, equity, and agriculture clear. And then we're going to take a break. After the break, we're going to come back and have some conversations, both in a big group and in some smaller breakout rooms. And one thing that I want to note before we get started is that the whole session is being recorded, both the presentation, but more importantly, the conversation we have after the presentation. And that is in order to capture the conversation that we have here today, so that we can bring the topics and insights that you all bring up out into the world. We really highly value your insights and personal experiences that you share. So we want to capture your thoughts faithfully so that the next steps will be reflective of the real experiences and desires that you have. We will also be passing ideas along to the Equity Subcommittee and hopefully taking this information into future conversations about climate change and farming in Maine. So here is some background for you. So in 2019, the Maine state legislature passed a bill called LD 1679, which set up climate change action goals and created the Maine Climate Council to develop strategies to achieve these goals. The state's climate goals are to reduce Maine's gross greenhouse gas emissions 45% below 1990 levels by 2030, and at least 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Another law passed by the legislature also requires that Maine's energy hit certain renewable generation goals over time. Governor Mills also signed an executive order requiring that the state achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, meaning that as much carbon as we emit each year must be sequestered in our natural and working lands and waters. LD 1679 also requires that the climate action work towards supporting resilience in Maine people and communities and industries, and that Maine's climate response is equitable and that it fosters economic opportunity and prosperity. And one thing I want to highlight here is that in the creation of the Climate Council, equity was one of the central things. So the last thing I'll say about this is that the process is ongoing, and the law requires that the climate action plans be delivered every 4 years. And the first one was delivered on December 1st of 2020. So I'm going to pass it off to Melissa, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the process.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So what is the Climate Council, and how did it create the current climate action plan? The Climate Council is a group of 39 people appointed by Governor Mills who represent a diverse range of industries, backgrounds, and perspectives from our state. It's made up of scientists, local and state officials, environmentalists, and stakeholders from different industries. At the same time, the Climate Council was formed in 2019. A scientific and technical subcommittee was convened to advise the council on the most up-to-date climate science, as were 6 working groups, each with a different focus. There's a transportation working group, a buildings working group, an infrastructure and housing working group, an energy working group, a community resilience and public health working group, a coastal and marine group, and a natural and working lands group. Each group was made up of about 30 stakeholders with experience in that field and an interest in how climate change will impact the field moving forward. The equity subcommittee was created later as recommended by the equity assessment, which Sarah will talk about in depth. I participated in the natural and working lands working group, which was made up of people from the forestry, farming, and conservation realms. We were tasked with coming up with strategies for achieving the governor's climate goals that Sarah just outlined, as well as how to help Maine mitigate and adapt to climate impacts, and how to build resilience for our environment and resilience in our natural resource industries, both of which make up a huge part of Maine's identity. So my goal with this slide was to create a simple timeline that clearly portrayed the process of Maine's climate action plan, but it turns out it wasn't a simple process at all. So I'll do my best to explain how it worked. So the Climate Council, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, and the 6 working groups were convened in September 2019. The working groups had 9 months to come up with recommended mitigation and adaptation strategies specific to their topic. We met, I think someone's not muted. I don't know who that is, but we met monthly in the beginning and then much more frequently as we approached the June deadline. Once the working group strategies were presented to the Climate Council in June of 2020, the UMaine Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions had the huge task of reviewing all of the strategies from all of the working groups with a specific focus on equity. And Sarah will dive much deeper into that process later. As all of this was taking place, Maine's leading climate scientists were preparing a report for the Climate Council called The Scientific Assessment of Climate Change and Its Effects in Maine. It incorporated the most up-to-date climate data specific to the state of Maine and made projections about how climate change will impact everything from ocean acidification to Maine's economy. I highly recommend taking a look at this report if you're interested in learning what the biggest climate threats are here in our state. And I think, Ryan, if you could drop a link into the chat, this link gives you access to the science report, the equity assessment, and the climate action plan. So feel free to browse. These are big documents. They aren't really very browsable, but I definitely recommend checking them out if you're interested in it. So yeah, with the scientific assessment, the Mitchell Center's equity assessment, and hundreds of recommended strategies from the 6 working groups, the Climate Council and the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future were then responsible for turning all of this information into a comprehensive plan for climate action. This climate action plan, titled Maine Won't Wait, was delivered to Governor Mills and the Maine legislature on December 1st of last year. Maine Won't Wait is a 4-year plan. It's meant to serve as a guide for policymakers as they introduce legislation, create laws, and implement them. The 2020 plan puts forth these 8 overarching strategies that you can see on the slide. And these are strategies for achieving the state's climate goals. Each one is broken down into sub-strategies and sub-sub-strategies in the actual plan itself. And the plan also formally convened the Equity Subcommittee. The Equity Subcommittee is tasked with setting equity outcomes for the climate strategies, making recommendations to the Climate Council to ensure programs and benefits reach diverse, marginalized, and isolated populations and communities, and monitoring progress as implementation unfolds. So we've been meeting, the Equity Subcommittee has been meeting monthly to talk about all of the strategies introduced in the Climate Action Plan and how we can improve equity outcomes for these strategies moving forward. Relating to agriculture, the climate action plans ended up fitting under 2 of the major strategies. Strategy D, grow Maine's clean energy economy and good jobs, and strategy E, protect Maine's environment and working lands and waters, and increase carbon sequestration. So strategy D is focused on how to grow Maine's economy and create jobs, while also maintaining the integrity of our natural resource industries. It includes recommendations like providing funding to support the use of agricultural and forestry mitigation and adaptation practices through education and incentives, incentivizing infrastructure and technology upgrades to support the adoption of those practices, including on-farm renewable energy use and other strategies to reduce fossil fuel usage on farms. Providing financial support to strengthen Maine's food systems so that more food can be produced and processed locally, distributed efficiently, and priced affordably. Today, just 10% of the food that Maine people consume is produced in our state. So this sub-strategy sets the measurable goal of increasing that percentage to 20% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. Strategy E focuses on protecting Maine's environment and sequestering carbon. It sets the goals of increasing the amount of conserved land through conservation easements, including agricultural conservation easements, to 30% of Maine's land by 2030. Keeping in mind that over 90% of Maine's topography is forested. So if we can conserve as much of that as possible, that leads to more carbon sequestration. It also recommends making natural climate solutions, such as soil health practices, a priority in federal and state agricultural programs, increasing technical service provider capacity to soil and water conservation districts, University of Maine Cooperative Extension, NRCS, and NGOs to assist producers in using known and emerging agricultural practices with mitigation and adaptation benefits, and developing incentives to increase carbon sequestration and storage, potentially through multi-state carbon programs. And so since last December, when these recommendations were published in the Climate Action Plan, a lot of great strides have been made to meet the agriculture-related goals. Through the American Rescue Plan Act, $20 million in funding has been allotted to invest in agriculture and food processing infrastructure here in Maine to increase the resilience in our industry and to contribute to the goal of increasing local food consumption in our state. The Land for Maine's Future program was passed with a state budget, and it infused $40 million for the conservation of working forests, farms, and commercial waterfronts, public access to our woods and waters, the protection and management of wildlife, and space for recreation. The Maine Healthy Soils program was a bill introduced by farmer and state senator Stacey Brenner and passed into law, which created a program within the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry aimed at connecting farmers with key resources and tools to help them adopt healthy soil practices. And there is currently an agriculture solar siting stakeholder group working to develop proposals for protecting Maine's agricultural lands and other natural resources, while at the same time promoting increased solar energy development. So there is some competition between big solar developments and agricultural lands. And this group is coming up with proposals that are expected to be incorporated into a bill for the next legislative session. And then finally, a permanent commission was passed into law to study the impacts of agricultural policies on farmers who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That was passed into law in June. All of this is to show that while climate change is something that is really easy to get overwhelmed by, there's a lot happening right here in Maine, specifically related to climate and agriculture, to help make agriculture and food production, our communities, and our whole state more resilient to its impacts. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sarah, who will transition to the equity part of this talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, so before we move forward, I'm going to take a step backward and step away from a focus on agriculture to make sure that we can all make the connection between equity and climate change. So I'm going to try to answer this question here for you. Why are we talking about climate and equity? So here's how I like to think about it. In Maine and across the world, those who have contributed the least to climate change will be impacted the most by its effects. Historic and ongoing oppression and marginalization of communities based on their race, class, age, and other demographic traits has caused these communities to be the least able to respond to climate effects. Inequitable housing conditions, adverse health effects, and a lack of political power create the conditions in which those at the front lines of the climate crisis suffer both the first and the worst from climate impacts. In Maine, people experiencing poverty tend to live in some of the oldest and least weatherized houses in the country. In Somerset County, you can see this little star on the map, people earning below 50% of the federal poverty level are spending an average of 61.8% of their income on energy. And a 2018 study from the Maine Office of the Public Advocate found that more than 50% of low-income homes had insufficient wall insulation, which is one of the highest rates in the country. So lack of access to the money necessary for retrofits that would make a house more efficient means that people experiencing poverty often spend more money to heat their homes than wealthier people who have access to the money for retrofits. This is compounded by increased exposure to the negative health effects of living in a poorly insulated home, including asthma, for example. So that's just one example, but I want to get you into the mindset of considering the root causes of inequality and how systems of oppression can be compounded to have the most negative effects for those who are already facing the largest systemic barriers. So when we talk about climate justice in Maine, we're talking about addressing the root causes of inequality, which means addressing systemic racism and focusing on the lack of resources available to frontline communities in Maine. So what do I mean by frontline communities? Frontline communities are those in which historic and systemic ongoing discrimination, underrepresentation, and isolation have caused the conditions in which communities are less able to adapt to climate change. In Maine, these communities are often low-income populations, people of color, and indigenous communities, and rural and geographically isolated communities. So just to wrap this up, I want to be sure to say that as we look towards a greener, less carbon intensive future, it's essential that the systems of oppression that lead to climate injustice aren't replicated in a clean energy future, which is why we make the explicit connection between climate and equity. So going back now to the process that Melissa walked you through, all that steps on that cool timeline that she made. In April of 2020, so after the working groups had been working together for almost a year, the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine was asked by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future to assess the potential equity outcomes associated with the Climate Council's recommendations. I was a part of the team that worked on this, so I'm going to quickly walk you through what we did and why. And what you see on the left here is the framework that we developed for assessing the potential equity outcomes of each of the strategies from all 6 of the working groups that Melissa mentioned earlier. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of how this framework is set up. So for each strategy, the framework provides an opportunity to look for equity outcomes from several angles. When addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies, the intended and unintentional outcomes are described as social and distributional impacts. This refers to both the risk of inequality arising due to unforeseen burdens, as well as the opportunity for positive benefits accruing as side effects of the target policy, otherwise known as co-benefits. Social and distributional impacts can generally be broken down into 3 categories: health, wealth, and accessibility. So for each strategy from each of the working groups, we asked, what would the impact of this strategy be on the wealth of Maine people, specifically frontline communities in Maine? Then we asked, what would the impact of this strategy be on the health of frontline communities in Maine? And finally, would this strategy impact access to necessary services or resources for Maine's frontline communities? The framework also addresses issues of participation. So in situations where frontline communities are likely to be affected by a proposed policy, the framework asks about the extent that those populations were meaningfully involved in the process of creating or implementing the policy. Well, meaningful is certainly a subjective term. I think that it's often clear whether outreach is an afterthought, like checking the box to say that you asked a certain community, or if it reflects the values and preferences of the community in question and provides them with the opportunity to meaningfully participate in agenda setting. The continuation of this work and report that we finished and submitted to the Maine Climate Council is the mission of the Equity Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council. So the Equity Subcommittee, as Melissa said, has met once a month since February to discuss how to ensure that the implementation of climate strategies in Maine is equitable. And just so you know, the charge of the Equity Subcommittee is to support ongoing planning and implementation of Maine's climate strategies to ensure shared benefits across diverse populations of Maine people, and to understand any concerns for implementation, to set clear equity outcomes for proposed actions, monitor progress, and make recommendations to ensure that programs and benefits reach the intended populations and communities, and to build on the equity assessment of working group recommendations prepared by the University of Maine during the development of the Climate Action Plan. So that's what the Equity Subcommittee is doing. And then finally, going back to the equity assessment that I was part of, I wanted to bring this back to agriculture and share with you some of the things we found during the equity assessment. So after looking at all of the recommendations from the Natural and Working Lands Working Group, which is where most of the content related to agriculture was located, these are some of the things we came up with that could strengthen the plan and make it more equitable. So if you remember the slide where Melissa was walking through some of the recommendations that the Natural and Working Lands Working Group made, these are the things that we found that we thought could strengthen equitable outcomes when those recommendations are implemented. So first, we thought that improving conservation of natural and working lands provides potential health co-benefits to frontline communities through the provision of ecosystem services like improved air quality and water quality. We also thought that while making management decisions related to land use and access, it's important to provide access to farmland to farmers who have dealt with systemic barriers to access. We think that providing access to land to new Mainer farmers, farmers of color, new farmers in general, and supporting existing low-income farmers will increase equity in Maine's food system. As it relates to food access, increasing access to farmers markets and Maine-grown food to frontline populations could potentially benefit the health of frontline communities. But we also noted that simply increasing production does not necessarily ensure greater access. So we recommended that specific actions should be taken to benefit frontline populations who are experiencing food insecurity and those who cannot or do not have access to farmers markets. And finally, we think it's important to include explicit plans for equitable outreach and education during the implementation of any sort of expanded technical support or funding or incentive programs for more sustainable agricultural practices. Historically, funding and assistance has been allocated to landowners and practitioners who are well educated and connected to those in positions of political power, while excluding those who perhaps need the assistance more. And we think that providing explicit information about how technical assistance will be distributed to landowners and practitioners who have been historically excluded can increase equity. And one last thing I'll note here is that we think it's really important to monitor and document strategies that are put in place to make sure that they are working. And so with that, we will pause and answer any questions that you have at this time.